In this week's episode of Bleach the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, the captains and the Vizard team up to fight Gerard Valkyrie, Orihime steps in to protect Ichigo from Yhwach, and Yhwach reveals a shocking truth about Ichibei's secret plot. Alright, here we are, episode 43 marks the end of the 3 episodes that were already shown in cinemas a month early, which means we are finally about to cross the threshold into completely new territory once again, which is very exciting. And like I said in my last live discussion, I have a feeling the next episode might be kind of crazy. But more on that at the end of the review, as I can finally make some actual predictions this time as I don't already know what's going to happen. In the meantime, however, we have episode 43, Blood for My Bone, to take a closer look at, and this was another good one. Now initially I thought that of the 3 episodes released so far, this was the wonkiest of them all, with the most ups and downs, but actually after having combed through it, for the purposes of this review, it is easily the most interesting of the bunch from a story perspective. This episode continues the trend of being roughly 50% new content, with essentially the entire first half of the episode being totally new. And with that comes some extremely interesting revelations and plot points that I can't help but think are setting up the end of the series itself. This is the kind of stuff that I love to see, and I hope we'll get even more of it as the arc crescendos towards its climax. Now I'm going to make a separate video on the Ichibei stuff, which should hopefully be out in a couple of days, but just know that I think it could be exactly what this portion of the arc needed in the manga to help it really stick the landing in a way I've been wanting it to for years now. And so, as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, episode 43, Blood for My Bone, as always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. And of course, if you want to help support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is through Patreon, where you get every single video free of YouTube ads, you get all the live reactions free of all the nonsense I have to do to get it on YouTube in the first place, and you get your name in the credits of every video as well. So do consider supporting me over there, where it makes a really huge difference. Let's begin this review then, and as always, we'll start by taking a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. And I've got to say, we are all over the place this time. In fact, I think the structure of this episode really lays bare just how much everything has been moved around. Once again, there isn't that much cut content in the grand scheme of things, though there are some bits here and there, but everything has just been totally reorganized, shuffled around. And to be fair, it does make sense, especially since the main thing they seem to be trying to achieve here is a sense of everything is happening all at the same time, rather than sequentially. And again, I can't help but think this is all going to line up somehow. Like if Rukia and Renji are going to disperse to different fights, that clearly won't happen until Gerard transforms into his final form based on the trailer. So will Rukia arrive in the throne room while Ichigo is using Horn of Salvation and before he uses his true bankai, or during the fact? Since I'm kind of expecting the Gerard fight to be mostly completed this coming week anyway. But I'm getting ahead of myself somewhat. Without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 43. First up we have chapter 658, Fatal Matters Are Cold. Chapter 659, There Will Be Frost. Chapter 666, Empty Puppet Temple. Chapter 667, Bigger, Louder, Stronger. Chapter 668, Bigger, Faster, Stronger, and finally chapter 675, Blood for My Bone, the episode title. So again, seems like quite a lot, right? But it's so funny to actually look at these chapters, to dive down into them. It's been multiple episodes now since we were supposed to have chapters 658 and 659, because the anime team has basically taken everything since the actual start of the Gerard fight, so after he grows gigantic, and pulled it through to here, now smashing them all together, while also running the Ichigo and Orihime versus Yhwach battle alongside it. So it's kind of like Uryu versus Hashwolf and Urahara and Yoroichi versus Askin ran concurrently, and now these fights will as well. Though, Uryu versus Hashwolf, by the time everything is said and done, is going to be the longest of the bunch at this rate, which is oddly fitting. However, as I mentioned in my discussion, chapter 675 is now officially the furthest we've reached in the anime. We are barely 10 chapters from the end, which is insanity, considering we still have 7 episodes left to go. And just like last time, only a couple of these chapters are even covered in full here. Anyway, let's move on to the spoiler analysis itself, as we take a deeper look at episode 43 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc titled Blood for My Bone. And of course, if you haven't yet hit subscribe, now is a great time to do so. It's a perfect time to help support the channel, help it grow and reach 300,000 subs. It's only going to be possible with your help, and I do greatly appreciate each and every one of you, so thank you all so very much. So despite the front half of this episode being entirely new content, it actually opens with a sequence from the manga. Taken from the opening of chapter 667, we see Kenpachi waking up inside Mayuri's restoration pod, kicking the door clean off before emerging. In a nice new detail, we can actually hear Kenpachi slowly walking through Varvelt afterwards. And what's interesting about this sequence is that in the manga, it's actually presented as a flashback. We don't see this moment until after Kenpachi has already arrived at the site of the battle against Gerard at the end of chapter 666. Here, though, everything is happening in real time, which actually I quite like. I think it's a bit neater, and that's presumably why we haven't seen Ikkaku and Yumachika yet. In the manga, those two don't arrive until after Kenpachi, and are surprised that he beat them there. To be totally honest, I know it's supposed to be saying how fast Kenpachi is, but considering the insane lead time they have on him, like 2 whole fights are done between them leaving Mayuri and Kenpachi and reaching Gerard. The entirety of Kyoraku versus Liege and the entirety of Kisuke versus Askin, they're both over. So I was never quite sure how that was possible without them basically running extraordinarily slowly. But I do wonder if they will keep this scene in or not. It feels like it might get moved or changed up a bit. What I mean is we are rapidly closing in on Kenpachi using bankai. It's probably going to happen next week, this Saturday, so maybe they will save the arrival of Ikkaku and Yumachika for that moment instead. They do react to Kenpachi's bankai in the manga, so maybe they'll fuse the 2 moments together. But we then return to Ichigo and Orihime versus Yhwach and are treated to a brand new anime-exclusive sequence focused almost entirely on Orihime, which is great. She's here to fight alongside Ichigo, so it's good to see the anime letting her get truly involved, and boy does she shine in a way I don't think anyone really saw coming. Orihime defends Ichigo from Yhwach's Soul King power with a shield, repelling the shadowy energy, before Yhwach continues to strike her, eventually shattering the shield and tossing Orihime up into the sky. Although she quickly conjures a second shield, Yhwach's power tears through it, and for a moment, Orihime appears to be helpless, smacked back and forward in the air. Yhwach tells Orihime that the same powers that flow within him also flow within Ichigo, so she is unconsciously accepting his attacks. Now, I'm not really sure what to make of this. I mean, is this meant to be literal? Presumably he's talking about the Soul King elements of his power, since that becomes the main topic of conversation here. But it just seems odd to me that this would even be a thing, but at the same time I guess it kind of makes sense. However, Ichigo appears between the 2 of them and takes the next hit, Yhwach slamming him into the ceiling of the throne room. As Orihime attempts to cushion Ichigo's fall with the shield, he crashes into her, and the 2 of them sprawl across the ground. And then we get maybe the craziest moment of the entire episode. While Ichigo lies injured on the floor, Orihime, herself bruised and beaten, gets back to her feet and defiantly holds out her hand to Yhwach. Grinning, Yhwach immediately exerts his Reiatsu, and a powerful black and red energy forces Orihime back down to the floor again, much in the same way he once quashed Basby over 1,000 years ago. And it's great, of course, to get that Reiatsu effect back again. The anime has used it very sparingly, but each time it is pretty cool and effective. This time, however, what's different between now and 1,000 years ago is that Orihime is also withstanding the brunt of the Soul King's Reiatsu as well, which makes this even more incredible. Not only is she withstanding it, maintaining both her physical form and her sense of self, but she seems remarkably okay, and as Yhwach tells her a mere human should consider it an honor to even be here, Orihime says that she won't let him hurt Ichigo. And again, as I've mentioned before, Orihime's power, which has been said before to transgress on God's domain, well, this is the perfect encapsulation of that. In a pretty glorious moment. Orihime's Rika activates once again, and she covers Ichigo in both a healing net and a protective shield, all while being pummeled by Yhwach's spiritual pressure, before conjuring a gigantic shield above the two of them, which she then proceeds to push upwards, quite literally forcing Yhwach's Soul King Reiatsu off of the top of them. Despite the immense stress and power tearing her arms to shreds, really cool detail by the way, Orihime manages to successfully reject Yhwach's Reiatsu, not only forcing it from the two of them, but even sending it barreling back towards the Quincy King. Not only does this sequence look beautiful here in the anime, with new effects added to Yhwach's power to help make it stand out even more when compared with the theatre release, but it cannot be overstated how insane a moment this is for Orihime's character. While in the manga, that scene from last week's episode of Orihime acknowledging that she can finally fight alongside Ichigo was kind of the ultimate culmination of her arc, actually here in the anime it more feels as though this is. Considering this version of Yhwach is one of, if not pretty much the strongest character in Bleach right now, this feels like an unfathomable realization of Orihime's long-held desire to no longer be a burden to Ichigo. Back in the Lost Agent arc, we were already seeing her take what felt like a pretty big step towards this, actively telling characters like Riruka and then later Ginjo that she won't allow Ichigo to be hurt as badly as he was atop the dome ever again. Well, this is the endgame version of that wish, of that resolve, of that declaration, and it is fantastic to see. She really has kind of come up alongside Ichigo in a way that feels, I would say, quite rare for the main cast of a shonen manga to manage to do. Obviously, she's not as strong as Ichigo, but in terms of her raw ability, of her defensive power, yeah, she's definitely up there. And the same also goes for Uryu. It's really only Chad who it kind of feels like is letting the side down a little bit. I mean, maybe he's not, but we just simply don't know what he's capable of. But with Orihime now giving him an opening, Ichigo is back on his feet and he unleashes a Getsuga Tensho at Yhwach, but the Quincy King simply blocks it. As Ichigo tells Yhwach he will cut him down, Yhwach warns him that to do so would be to destroy the world, as he has become the world itself. I mentioned this before, but I'll reiterate it here. I am so glad the anime is making this into the big deal that it rightfully is. After Yhwach absorbed the Soul King in the manga, the very idea of the Soul King, and everything kind of adjacent to him, the Zero Division, it was all just dropped. Whereas in reality, it shouldn't be, because nothing's changed. The Soul King, the nature of the Soul King, it should still very much be the focus. It's just the target is now different. And yes, there's now a fascinating dilemma at the center of the fight. How can Ichigo kill Yhwach when Yhwach is now the Soul King? They were supposed to be protecting the Soul King. Won't killing him destroy the worlds? This is a really great, fundamental question to have at the crux of your final battle. And it's just one that the manga completely glossed over, even in the epilogue. And so the fact the anime is making this into a huge plot point is very encouraging to me, very encouraging. It tells me that their priorities are in the right place moving into the finale. And then, moving over to Uryu versus Hashwolf once again, Hashwolf reveals that while he is in possession of Yhwach's power, he can use it as he pleases, essentially having free control over it, free reign. Which not only answers my question from last time, where I wondered if maybe Yhwach was controlling said power, like he seems to have influence over the many disparate parts of Varvelt, but also this again feels like a massive departure from the manga, where it's made very clear that Hashwolf can only operate a very cut-down version of the Almighty. But here it's pretty explicitly said that due to Hashwolf being Yhwach's other half, again a concept which was brought up but then kind of forgotten about in the manga, he can wield this power seemingly to its fullest potential. As Hashwolf mentions Uryu surviving Yhwach's Owl's Valen, something that I imagine will come up again in the future, he begins to bombard Uryu with waves of this shadowy power, which Uryu attempts to dodge, all while firing a repeating volley of arrows back down at Hashwolf, who continues to evade them by seeing into the future. In a really cool sequence, Uryu seals himself inside a shimmering blue defensive reishi shell, which is then battered and smacked around on all sides by Hashwolf's power, the sternritter Grandmaster attempting to penetrate the glass-like walls on all sides, his attacks sending Uryu and the shell spinning throughout the fortress. Again, it looks awesome, it's pretty creative, it's unique, and this is all completely new. But Hashwolf also reiterates that Uryu's own fight, his own conviction, has been a contradiction all along. Yhwach has now become one with the Soul King, and for them to want to kill him means killing the world. Eventually, Hashwolf shatters the shell and impales Uryu on a number of spikes, seriously wounding him. There's a cool little moment here where Uryu rips some of the Almighty's power from his arm and crushes it. Also, Hashwolf's personality has materially changed since he awakened his Almighty. His version of the Almighty, which is something we'll discuss in a little bit, but he's become far more animated and sadistic, which again is something that I mentioned noticing back in my episode 41 review, and I kind of like it. It makes him feel far less passive as a villain. But Ichigo tells Yhwach that he knows the people who are trying to protect the world. He knows what it means to them, and he wants to protect them and countless others, plus all that they hold dear. And if that means destroying the world, then so be it. Obviously, it's a bit of a paradox, and it doesn't really make sense, but the sentiment is clear. Ichigo will do everything in his power to stop Yhwach, even if that means killing him, and threatening the world along with him, presumably anticipating that they would then find a way to prevent the worlds from collapsing. Which leads us to our next point. As Ichigo launches yet another Getsuga Juji show at Yhwach, the anime is getting so much more out of that ability than the manga ever did. The Quincy King stops the Golden Cross blast in its tracks with a wall of shadowy power. This is another really cool visual. Not only does Yhwach defend himself, but he manages to essentially capture the attack in stasis, and there's a ton of religious imagery on show here, as this golden cross can scarcely penetrate this vine-like wall of darkness in front of it, before eventually being swallowed up by the shadows entirely. Meanwhile, Yhwach muses that because Ichigo instinctually understands the truth, he hesitates to take his enemy down completely. It's at this point the episode takes a rather sudden turn. Yhwach suddenly brings up a character who, for all intents and purposes, was completely and utterly forgotten by this point in the manga. Yhwach warns Ichigo that everything is happening exactly according to none other than Ichibei Hyosabei's plan, and as he does so, we see Ichibei himself hidden away in the Blood Oath Seal chamber. Using Ichimonji, Ichibei paints a circle into life upon the huge canvas at the back of the room, the one that used to contain the 4 emblems of the other 4 Zero Division members. Each one of those smaller canvas had one of the individual emblems, while that bigger one contained all 4 at the same time. And interestingly, that canvas has been repaired since the last time we saw it. When we last saw it, Senjumaru's candle had burned a huge hole in it. But Yhwach tells Ichigo that Ichibei took him in, gave him the Soul King's memories, and then judged his power to be worthy or not, because Ichigo and Ichigo alone is a miracle. He is a perfect hybrid, a human, Shinigami, Hollow, Fullbring, and Quincy fusion made almost totally naturally. You could argue that the presence of Aizen's experimental Hollow isn't 100% organic, but it's as close as anyone has ever gotten. And this is when things get, frankly, really kind of off the wall. Yhwach then asks Ichigo why he wears black. And I have to assume when he asks this, he's referring to not just Ichigo, but presumably every Shinigami within the Gotei 13 whose Shihakusho is their official uniform. Hashwolf then takes this a step further, saying that black is the color of chaos. Chaos is the power of the Soul King, and therefore black, the color without color, is no less than the Soul King's own Reiatsu. And of course, as we know, the one who controls black, all the black in the world, is none other than Ichibei Hyosabei. Alright, let's just pump the brakes for a second there. These are some of the craziest plot revelations we've ever had, and they've kind of just been dropped out of nowhere. So, what does this actually mean? Ichibei controls all the black in the world. So is all the black in the world, is that the Soul King's power, his Reiatsu? The very same black that Ichibei wields through his Zanpakuto Ichimonji. And when we call it the Soul King's Reiatsu, are we doing so in the same way Pernida is the Soul King's left arm, or Gerard is the Soul King's heart? Is Ichibei the actual wielder of the Soul King's Reiatsu? I think we're about to learn some pretty seismic stuff about Ichibei, and I do hope it all leads back to that proper Soul King flashback, because it seems like Ichibei has, probably in the wake of Adnias' fall, somehow given himself control over the Soul King's power. Or maybe the Soul King gave it to him himself? I don't know if this is going to somehow tie into the origin of Ichibei and his Zanpakuto or what, but it's no coincidence that Ichibei happens to control the Soul King's power while the Soul King is imprisoned and sealed. And I did wonder about this before, as I mentioned in a previous video, because it's kind of weird and just unexplained to date how Ichibei was wielding the left arm 1,000 years ago. Returning to the episode, Ichibei paints a black ring upon the huge canvas, which transforms into a salamander of sorts. The salamander crawls up Ichibei's back, sits upon the dish that he's holding, and then liquefies into this kind of black substance, which Ichibei then drinks for himself. As this happens, the 4 candles, each one representing the individual Zero Division members, flare up. So, what does this mean? I've seen people saying Ichibei is resurrecting the Zero Division. That's totally possible. It could absolutely be that. But I don't know. I feel like this is meant to be Ichibei restoring his own powers after being resurrected. Why the candles would flare up when that happens, I have no idea. And also, now we know that he's literally taking the Soul King's power into his body when he drinks this black liquid. Like I said, I'm doing a whole video on this, so for the time being, I do want to move on as we still have a lot to discuss, but this is definitely the most fascinating part of the episode in my opinion, and while the community has long ruminated on this idea of Ichibei being the villain, or whether he's just someone who's willing to do what is necessary to maintain the status quo, there's no doubt the anime is trying to make Ichibei appear as sinister as possible right now, and I think it's all leading up to potentially a slightly new ending for the series. Yhwach straight up tells Ichigo that Ichibei plans on making him the new Soul King, basically as soon as Ichigo kills Yhwach, a puppet whose only purpose is to not only hold the 3 worlds together as Adnias had done, but to maintain a world with the Shinigami on top, which interestingly was also kind of the gist we got from that flashback from 1,000 years ago, where Ichibei basically wanted Yhwach and the Quincy's to stay in their lane, because the Shinigami are the masters of the worlds as they currently are. The sad thing is, unless there are some truly earth-shattering changes planned for the way this anime ends, Ichibei is gonna get what he wants at the end of the day. And again, who necessarily says that's a bad thing? After all, the 3 worlds have been operating just fine for however long, and they probably are better than whatever alternate future Yhwach wishes for. But these worlds and their existence are built on the back of a pretty sizable and grim sin. But of course, this is Ichibei's version of peace, that ever-cryptic cliffhanger from the manga that was never expanded upon until Can't Fear Your Own World. Well, now the anime is turning it into a full subplot which will likely, in my opinion, coincide with the end of the series. Peace, which for Ichigo simply means death, or even a fate worse than death. Of course, in very typical Ichigo fashion, he simply responds to all of these, frankly, mind-bending revelations with a casual, "So what?" Which isn't unexpected, but can begin to defy belief a little bit, in my opinion, after a while. This is beat for beat very similar to what happened at the end of the Lost Agent arc, where Ichigo was confronted by a terrible truth about the Gotei 13 thanks to Ginjo, only to essentially shrug it off. Only this is potentially 10 times worse for Ichigo, I would argue, and yet it still elicits the same response. And who knows, maybe Ichigo already guessed this was Ichibei's intent to some degree, but really it doesn't matter to him right now. All that matters is taking Yhwach down, or else there won't be anything for him to protect as a potential Soul King anyway. With that, Ichigo leaps at the Quincy King and carves into him with a brilliant golden slash, seemingly dealing a colossal tangible hit. As we reach the episode's halfway point or so, we are treated to an information card about Hashwolf's new form, wherein it reveals that yes, he takes on elements of Yhwach's own nature, which is why his personality has shifted somewhat, which again I think is pretty cool. Though the idea of them being two halves would surely imply some kind of balance. Yet it's always felt very one-sided to me. Does Yhwach ever take on remnants of Hashwolf's power or personality, for example? Anyway, the entirety of that first half of the episode was completely brand new, which is kind of crazy. But no longer. We're now moving back into manga territory for the most part, as we return to Sternritter M, the Miracle, Gerard Valkyrie, the Titan stomping through the city streets. Which takes us right back to chapter 658. Though actually, this one shot of Gerard's face as he passes by the screen comes from chapter 656, God of Thunder. I didn't include it at the start because it's literally a single panel, but there you go. So, despite the Vizard's dramatic cliffhanger at the end of episode 40, where they all gathered to face Gerard, they've since all been scattered, with Hiyori and Hachi taking cover from the Quincy and nearby building. As Gerard notes he can barely sense their faint spiritual pressure, we see Hiyori and Hachi making a run for it, while also checking in with the other Vizard, which is new. I have to be honest, I do really like this shot of Shinji hiding on a windowsill. That looks pretty awesome. Suddenly, Gerard spins round and takes out a nearby tower, having located some of the Vizard thanks to his ability of the Miracle. One of its many strengths being that Gerard can make the impossible possible. The worse the odds of something happening, the more likely it'll be to happen. Here, there was no chance Gerard could locate the Vizard amidst the cityscape, so the Miracle made it happen. As an aside, it's cool to see that Hinamori is still actively involved here too, even though she doesn't actually do anything. Hiyori leaps at Gerard from behind, telling him that his power of miracles is just gibberish to them, while calling him Baldy in her trademark way. Gerard simply replies that he's not bald, to which Hiyori grumbles that he can't be serious with that comeback as she harnesses her hollow mask and charges a triple Zero, unleashing a massive red laser at the Quincy. Gerard instantly dispels the triple Zero with a wave of his hand, however, roaring that he would never fall for such an attack. However, as Hiyori drops from the sky, we do get a bit of new content for the Vizard's fight against Gerard. In the manga, this is where Love, Lisa, and Hachi jump in only to be immediately defeated. Yet here the others do all get a bit extra to do. Shinji arrives and releases Sakanade, instantly flipping and reversing everything around Gerard. Gerard, amused by the power, tries to grab Shinji but of course completely misses him. Instead, jumping down from above, Shinji lands on Gerard's neck and stabs him, clearly injuring the giant, who rises up bellowing in pain as blood spurts out. And as I mentioned in my live discussion, Shinji is capable of breaking Gerard's skin, which to me only means it makes less sense that these guys achieve as little as they do here. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself again. With Gerard seemingly vulnerable, Rose impales him in the chest with Kinshara, telling him he'll let him hear the tritone, which I'm guessing is a new ability of his, or it's meant to be the triple attack between himself, Kensei, and Mashiro. Whatever it is, we don't really know. But as he does so, Kensei, using bankai, and Mashiro in completely the wrong outfit, leap at the sternritter. Kensei punches Gerard in the chest, while Mashiro slams her foot into him with Super Mashiro kick, and together they do seem to injure the Goliath. But here we then return to the manga, as Hachi, Love, and Lisa suddenly jump Gerard from behind. Hachi unleashes a Kido spell Chocolate Bar Slider, while Love wields his Shikai Tengumaru and prepares Hifuki no Kazuchi, the same fire attack he used against Stark. Meanwhile, Lisa, also using her Shikai Hagoro Tonbo, reveals a new attack, Niju Ichijo Tonbo Kudari, and their three attacks collide with Gerard in a colossal explosion. With Gerard reeling from the blast, the 8 Vizard all come together, somehow standing on the air despite the fact they shouldn't be able to do that in Varvelt, for one final strike. They each summon their hollow masks if they hadn't done already, and then they conjure their own Zero, with their own individual colours, and unleash 10 Zero at once. Hiyori is using the triple one again. a rainbow blast of energy rocketing towards Gerard. There's no denying this does look extremely cool. I do wish we had seen a full-on laser blast, but it does look really awesome, even if the shot of the collective Vizard is literally just lifted from this group shot from the fake Karakura Town arc. Seriously, why is Hachi holding his Zanpakuto like that to use a Sero? Why is Hiyori in the middle of unsheathing her Zanpakuto like that for the triple Sero? Considering we just saw her using her hands a moment ago, this doesn't feel very conducive to me, but it doesn't really matter because it does look awesome. Lisa wields a dark blue Sero, Love a light blue Sero, Hiyori the standard red, Shinji now has a golden yellow Sero while Hachi's is pink, Mashiro has a green Sero while Rose has a purple one, and Kensei's is orange. Again, I can't overstate how really cool this looks. It feels like fanfiction in the best possible way, and it just makes the outcome all the more disappointing, and frankly ridiculous, to be totally honest. As the collection of Seros slam into Gerard with a violent explosion, Hinamori whispers that they've won. But not only have they not won, Gerard emerges from the smoke completely and utterly unharmed, which is just ridiculous, again, before taking out all 8 Vizard with a single swing of his arm. Yeah, like I said in my live discussion, in some ways, for as cool as this is, it does feel like it's worse than the manga. I mean, that's obviously facetious, because it's obviously not. But now Gerard takes out all 8 of them in one hit, rather than just 4 of them, and he survives. Far worse here in the anime, again, all without taking any damage. How is it that Shinji stabbing him in the neck is by far the most effective thing they do? Why don't they keep doing that? Why is it that Shinji Sakanade is just no longer working all of a sudden, when it seems like that would be a really good counter to Gerard, who's unlikely to necessarily pick up on what's going on particularly quickly? Why isn't Love using bankai? There must be more Kido that Hachi can use. And also, maybe it doesn't work this way because Gerard is part of the Soul King and perhaps not a normal Quincy. But surely their Hollow Reiatsu should be having some kind of deleterious effect. This isn't just a small amount of Hollow Reiatsu, this Quincy gets struck by 10 Sero all at once. That's an awful lot of Hollow Reiatsu. Now again, I just want to reiterate, I'm not even that big of a fan of the Vizard. I like Rose, I like Shinji, and the rest of them are fine. But I guess I like to root for the underdog sometimes. It's a shame to go back to the well of the same captains over and over, but I also do get it. Especially, back when the manga was coming out, this was the last hurrah. So it makes sense to give the most popular captains the spotlight. Speaking of which, it does kind of seem like Soifon might be done. You would think Suzumebachi might be quite useful against an opponent who's this big a target. But I mean, maybe she'll get back up again later on. And I mean, look, as we already gleaned from the trailers, it was fairly obvious the Vizard weren't really going to achieve anything. But that does make me wonder why they bothered really with the episode 40 cliffhanger at all. I guess it was a cool moment that got people talking. But I also don't want to be too hasty. I mentioned a minute ago that Soifon might get back up again. It's totally possible the Vizard might also get back up again. I kind of feel like that could be the case. Kubo also didn't draw death arts for these characters, so maybe they are still actually kicking about. But to end this segment on a positive note, this is a really nice little sequence. I'm glad it's here. It is better than the manga, obviously. I'm being facetious. The 8-person Sero is a really fantastic visual. It's just kind of absurd that they don't do anything to Gerard. It's kind of a shame that it achieves nothing. But again, I'm still hoping these guys might get back up again. But yeah, and ultimately characters like Love, Lisa, and Hachi, they don't get anything else to do here. Really all we're doing is ensuring the other Vizard get to show at least something off, and I appreciate that all the same. But that then takes us to the end of chapter 658, as Gerard prepares to annihilate the entire platform, to drop all of the Vizard at once, when suddenly his arm is frozen in place from afar, as Toshiro Hitsugaya arrives. As this next little sequence is fairly faithful to the manga, there is so far no sign of Matsumoto. I have a feeling she might arrive later on perhaps, but I'm not personally expecting her to get involved unless literally everyone gets involved in some way, like say Ikkaku and Yumichika when they arrive later on. As we begin chapter 659, Hitsugaya and Gerard introduce themselves to each other before Hitsugaya flies past Gerard and activates Bankai. Again, considering the Shinigami can't manifest footholds, it's kind of interesting watching all this play out. Like, how are the Vizard, again, simply standing in midair to fire their Sero? How is Hitsugaya flying past Gerard before activating bankai? Anyway, as Hitsugaya flash freezes Gerard in place, Hinamori watches him from far below. In the manga, she's carrying an unconscious Shinji on her shoulder at this point, so maybe the fact that he's not here is a sign. Anyway, we continue onwards into chapter 675. And here's the thing, right? At the start of this chapter, Uryu draws his brand new bow against Hashwolf, the same one he materializes at the end of the previous chapter. This hasn't happened yet in the anime, but we know that it is happening to some degree thanks to the trailer. So I'm kind of assuming these manga sections of Uryu versus Hashwolf have not been cut, not all of them anyway, and they will appear later, but they will hopefully still be reworked. Hopefully we won't just start cutting away from this fight all the time with nothing being resolved. Meanwhile, Yhwach's body reforms itself where he was slashed by Ichigo, which effectively means he's been consumed by the Soul King's power, to the point where it's perhaps remaking his body, though this is a little weird because when Yhwach is struck by the still silver arrow later on, it's very clear he's just wearing this power atop his old self. But as I mentioned in my discussion, it goes some way to explaining why Ichigo's Getsuga Gran Rei Sero from the manga seems to carve right into Yhwach's form, only for it to basically amount to nothing. Here, though, in another new action sequence, Ichigo lunges for Yhwach, finally taking the fight to him properly, swinging, carving, and hacking away at his Soul King power. Orihime watches from the sidelines, barely able to keep up with Ichigo's immense speed. As Yhwach conjures a bunch of shadowy discs, Ichigo cuts through them all before being forced backwards as he's overwhelmed. As he prepares to lunge at Yhwach once more, we suddenly cut straight to the manga. Orihime grabs Ichigo's Shihakusho at the last moment. Again, although this is in the manga, this is another very impressive moment for her, managing to grab Ichigo even in the midst of him moving at an unbelievable speed. Orihime, terrified that Ichigo is losing his way, tells him to calm down. But he glances back at her for a split second and she sees not a face of rage or confusion, but one who is in actuality totally content and in control. So Orihime releases him and Ichigo returns to the fight, an unspoken plan now underway. This next sequence all comes from chapter 675, as Yhwach ponders why Ichigo is seemingly so willing to throw his life away, watching as Orihime tries to protect him as if telling him to stop. A lot of this again is honestly really nice looking, but as Ichigo goes flying backwards once more, he suddenly notices the tip of his Zanpakuto toe turning white. Interestingly, in the manga, he calls out for Orihime here, but in the anime, she seems to instinctively realize and conjures her gigantic shield just in time, protecting the two of them from Yhwach's blast. It's kind of crazy to think that this was her lone incredible display of power in this fight in the manga, whereas in the anime we've gone way beyond that, it feels. As we reach the end of chapter 675 and Ichigo's blade turns white, Yhwach's Quincy Reiatsu pumping through it, he disappears in the middle of a gigantic, flaming explosion, only to reappear in a totally new form, his singular horn carving through the smoke as the Horn of Salvation is at long last revealed. This moment is kind of designed to be the cliffhanger ending of the episode itself, but it's a bit awkwardly placed, as there's still quite a bit left to go. But it is cool to finally see this form, which has been teased countless times in the trailers now, and I have to wonder, will we see it again next week, or this week? Or is this week going to exclusively focus on Gerard's fight? Orihime is the focus of the credits this time around, deservedly so, and then we carry on with the remainder of the episode, which takes us back a few chapters to chapter 666. Well, Hitsugaya preparing to finish Gerard off, that's totally new. But when Gerard breaks free of the ice, that's when we return to the manga. As Gerard reaches for Hitsugaya in a pretty cool shot that captures the overwhelming size of the Titan, Byakuya suddenly intervenes, blocking Gerard's strike with his bankai. In a new moment, one of Hitsugaya's petals breaks, while Byakuya notes that he doesn't like the miracle, but must admit it's extremely strong, which I feel like kind of echoes how a lot of people feel about the Shrift in general. As Byakuya and Hitsugaya discuss the little captain's height in the face of Gerard, the sternritter lunges for them again, when suddenly his arm is cut clean off in a shower of blood. Kenpachi arrives, lamenting the defeat of so many of the Gotei 13. Moving back into chapter 667, Gerard's arm is restored in a ray of brilliant gold light, which I think does look pretty nice, honestly, and we'll be seeing a lot more of that next time around. As Kenpachi prepares to cut Gerard up, Hitsugaya gets in his way, blocking his fellow captain's strike. Concerned for what might happen if Gerard falls from Varvelt at this size, Hitsugaya warns Kenpachi against fighting him so recklessly. However, Gerard suddenly brings his colossal foot down upon the two of them, attempting to crush them outright, but Kenpachi catches the giant's foot and launches him backwards. Again, I quite like the animation of Gerard teetering and staggering backwards before he collapses into the main fortress. It looks awesome. And I do think the anime is doing a really good job of capturing Gerard's overall size here. Things are going to be interesting, I think, when he releases his Volston dish and practically doubles in size again. As Kenpachi then pounces on the downed Gerard, he swings his blade at him, but Gerard defends himself with his shield before using it to swat Kenpachi like a fly, sending him soaring across the city. Again, there's another nice shot where we see Kenpachi being flung overhead while Hitsugaya watches from below. As Gerard gets back on his feet, he draws his blade Hoffnung and prepares to fight. At the same time, Kenpachi responds by releasing his Shikai, Nozarashi, and is engulfed in a flaming yellow Reiatsu, his new blade on show once again. Watching this, Byakuya muses that maybe there was never such a thing as a constant release type Zanpakuto after all, putting to bed years of endless speculation and discussion. To be totally honest, I've long forgotten where the idea of a constant release Shikai came from. Obviously, Ichigo was believed to have one at one point and Kenpachi was the same, but I don't think it's actually ever brought up in the manga. I could be totally wrong about that, but either way, this line is here to, firmly put that to bed once and for all. As Kenpachi locks blades with Gerard, forcing the giant back once again, he accidentally chips Gerard's blade, resulting in a massive wound opening up on the Shinigami's body, spraying blood everywhere. This is the final shot from chapter 667, but here in the anime we get a nice additional moment where both Byakuya and Hitsugaya also go in for an attack, the two of them directing their abilities towards Gerard. However, they also strike Hoffnung, damaging the blade and in turn causing huge injuries to appear on themselves as well. I like this new addition a lot, and I hope it's a signal that the anime plans to incorporate these two into this fight a lot more than they really were in the manga. Also, both Byakuya and Hitsugaya came away from this battle, it felt like virtually uninjured, so I'm glad to see them actually taking some hits here too. As we arrive at the end of the episode, we begin chapter 668, with Kenpachi wondering what just happened. Gerard explains his power of the miracle in some fairly abstract terms, revealing that his indestructible body is enlarged by the fears of the masses, while Hoffnung represents the hopes of the masses, and when it breaks, those masses will despair, with that very despair carved into his enemy's body. As an injured Kenpachi, Byakuya, and Hitsugaya catch their breath, watching as Gerard roars with laughter. And by the way, the shot of him looming over Kenpachi is both pretty cool and, pretty ominous as well. Another of Hitsugaya's ice petals shatters, indicating the countdown is well and truly on. So that's it for the episode. Now, the poem this week is very interesting. The voice absolutely sounds like Unohana to me, and she reads, "I will transform this life of mine." Now, that could be Unohana referring to how she'll transform her life on the surface, from Yachiru to Retsu, or even a more abstract transformation, converting her life into Kenpachi's power. It may also indicate that we're getting a new flashback next week, perhaps as Kenpachi releases his bankai. After all, that's clearly what this poem is a prelude to. But is it possible that this is actually Nozarashi's voice? It certainly wouldn't surprise me if she had the same voice as Unohana, and maybe even looked like her as well. Of course, Nozarashi's bankai spirit is Yachiru, but as for the Shikai? Well, we've never seen it, but who knows, perhaps we will next time. Maybe "I will transform this life of mine" is literally referencing how Nozarashi will now allow Kenpachi to use Shikai, literally transforming it, and maybe we'll see them meeting in the aftermath of Unohana's death. Well, let's move on to the predictions for next week, as there's no Sternritter in Memoriam this time around. And to be completely honest, I'm not entirely sure when the next one's going to be. So, as for next time, episode 44, titled The Perfect Crimson, well, immediately the title seems to indicate that we will be getting Hitsugaya's adult transformation from chapter 671. And if that's the case, then I genuinely think episode 44 might cover everything there is left to see from Gerard's fight. It's totally possible that the episode will end with Hitsugaya's transformation from the end of chapter 670, that cliffhanger, but then why call the episode The Perfect Crimson? Why not call it something relating to Kenpachi's bankai? If it does cover the entirety of the Gerard fight, that means the rest of chapter 668, 669, 670, 671, and 672. That sounds like a lot. But bear in mind, much of that is fighting. Big panels, no dialogue. The chapter Kenpachi releases his bankai, for example, translated to the anime, that would genuinely take maybe 3 minutes to breeze through. Now, I'm sure they will expand on Kenpachi's bankai just as they did Kisuke's, as both of them were highly anticipated, and yet ultimately felt a bit rushed in the manga. From the trailer we can see Bankai Kenpachi attacking Volstendish Gerard, which doesn't happen in the manga, so there is an extension happening somewhere. But I could be wrong, and we might just flip back and forth between that fight and Ichigo's once again, maybe some Uryu versus Hashwolf. However, I can't help but think they would do well to maybe just focus entirely on Gerard's battle this time around, especially since you don't really want to take away from either Kenpachi's bankai or the Horn of Salvation. Like, I can't help but feel like the ultimate reveal of Horn of Salvation was lessened a little bit by it kind of just happening in the middle of this episode. And again, a lot of this comes down to how they want to end Gerard's fight. We know again from the trailer that he will assume his light form from chapter 672, so maybe that sequence with Rukia and Renji happens at the start of episode 5, which then leads into Ichigo versus Yhwach. To be fair, despite the controversy, it's actually not that hard to see why they only went with 10 episodes this time around. Like, even just laying this all out, if they were to cover Gerard's fight next week, and then say Ichigo versus Yhwach the week after, we would have, like, only 5 chapters of the manga left to cover in 5 episodes, which is already going to result in a crazy amount of new content. Would I have preferred the standard 13? Of course. But it's also not hard to see why they did it. Anyway, this Saturday I am definitely expecting both Kenpachi's bankai and Hitsugaya's completed bankai, and obviously we will get Gerard's holy form too, which I'm also excited to see. And I'm so curious to see if the anime does anything with his strange Quincy Cross core. But alright everyone, that's it for today's review of Bleach the 1000-Year Blood War Arc, episode 43, titled Blood for My Bone. Another great episode, loads to talk about, loads of really interesting lore stuff this week, loads of interesting story beats, plot threads that simply were not touched upon in the manga, and that makes me very excited for what's still to come. That really hypes me up more than anything else. Though of course I cannot wait to see Kenpachi's bankai in action, Hitsugaya's completed bankai in action, all of that. There's still loads left to come, loads to be excited about, so yeah, I really can't wait. Let me know your thoughts on episode 43 down in the comments below. Did you enjoy this one? How did you feel about it? And now that we're finally free of those 3 cinema episodes, which was your favourite of the bunch? Let me know down in the comments below. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and theories, so please do let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already to help support the channel on our journey to 300,000 subs. It's only going to be possible with your help. And also check out the Patreon as well, where you can take the support from me another step further. That is making a huge difference. That's where you can really go to help support the channel an extra step. Go the extra mile. It's greatly, greatly appreciated, and it does mean absolutely everything, so thank you all so very much. But alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.